boundary waters, send the minerals to China, where they'll be processed with the sweetheart deal and then sold on the open market. And that is not an America First strategy. So I encourage my colleagues to take a look at who's benefiting from this mine, and it certainly will not be in the long run Minnesotans. There are no real winners here except for this massive Chilean company. So, Mr. President, in a few hours we're going to be voting on this resolution, and I urge my colleagues to vote no on rolling back protections for the Boundary Waters Wilderness Area. We can support mining in Minnesota and in this country, but not this mine in this place. We can be good stewards of our natural resources and support mining, but not this mine. These public lands belong to all of us, and we should not allow them to be exploited for our loss and the gain of others far, far away. With that, I would yield the floor to my colleague, Senator Klobuchar, who has been such a strong champion for Minnesota for so many years.
President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Mr. President, I thank Senator Smith. This bill is an unprecedented use of a procedural mechanism that would have far-reaching consequences, not just for the boundary waters, as Senator Smith has explained, but for public lands across our country. So I have always supported science-based review, especially a project so close to this cherished Boundary Waters Canoe area. And I continue to have concerns about this administration's disregard for science. So, as many of my colleagues know, I am the granddaughter of an iron ore miner. My great-grandparents came from Slovenia, and that was a job that my great-grandpa came to do. He died very young from his work, and then my grandpa took it up, and he started very, very young, underground mines with a number of brothers and sisters that he took care of when his parents died, married my grandma, and this was his life. And he loved that life. But he mostly also loved the time he had in the outdoors. He loved to hunt, he loved to fish, and every day he would go down 1,500 feet in that cage in that mine, and I always thought about what he thought about with that black lunch bucket that my grandma packed for him every single day in that little house that they had taken when a mine closed down in Babbitt, and they put it on the back of a flatbed truck, and they blew a hole with dynamite in the ground and put that house on top of it. That was their life. And my grandpa worked most of his life in the mines and had so many friends. He became, in his later years, the foreman of the mine, and I would meet people when I was first running for United States Senate up in northern Minnesota that would say to me, you know, my dad worked with your grandpa. And whenever they explored a dangerous part of the mine, the other foreman wouldn't go. They'd radio down from above. But your grandpa, he went first. He went with the guys, and he went down in the mine. Such a big part of my life. And that's why I have stood with our miners. I have stood with them when we had steel dumping from China and brought President Obama's chief of staff up to northern Minnesota, met with our steel workers and our unions. I have stood with our workers through good times and bad, and will continue to do that. We have, as Senator Smith explained, some exciting new projects up there like Mesabi Metallics, which is going to be a big taconite mine, modern mine with some of the biggest equipment in the country, and we will have more. But what this is about today is something else, because my grandpa always got that balance. There's a balance of the working life that we must continue up in northern Minnesota, and a balance of the world around him, that world where he loved to hunt and he loved to fish. I was 18 years old before I took a vacation that didn't involve a tent or a camper in one way or in the other. I grew up in a family that valued the outdoors. My mom and dad met in the Twin Cities Hiking Club. And generations of Minnesotans have found this same joy, hiking, paddling, camping in the Boundary Waters and our beautiful parks. But I don't think they would have ever expected this. HJ Resolution 140, as I noted, is an unprecedented use of a procedural mechanism that would have far-reaching consequences, not just for the BWCA, but for other public lands. Secretaries of the Interior have long had the ability to issue public land orders to reserve federal land for specific uses, setting it aside for things like infrastructure, certain military purposes, training and border security, or protection and conservation. And public land orders are carefully made. The U.S. Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management gathers public input. They hold town halls, they analyze impacts. But now, for the first time, the Congressional Review Act is being used to rescind a public land order. Public land orders have never been considered rules under the CRA and have never been submitted to Congress as rules. Today, the CRA before the Senate is being used simply as a way of revoking the land withdrawal without having to conduct that public engagement. And this unprecedented use of the CRA will have broader disruptive impacts on land management agencies' ability to oversee public lands all across the country. This process is focused on northern Minnesota today, but this new precedent could lead to Congress overturning public land orders elsewhere. The Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service have long been trusted with working with landowners, nearby towns and counties, and others to develop plans for managing public lands. This is often a give and take process built on trust. But this Congress, for the first time, has disrupted decades of work by the Bureau of Land Management and has stepped in the way of locally led land management. These CRA resolutions disregard extensive public input. If this CRA resolution were approved, public access to some of the nation's most treasured landscapes could be lost and the careful management of their lands and waters eliminated. There are hundreds of public land orders that have been issued to protect our public lands that could be put at risk. The Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge in Montana, considered a sportsman paradise for its elk and bighorn sheep hunting. The 355,000 acres of federal land near the Chaco Canyon National Historical Park in New Mexico. The precedent potentially being established today could pave over the comprehensive process undermining these landowners. The CRA even threatens the protected status of the Grand Canyon, which happens to sit on significant mineral deposits. This precedent could lead to CRA resolutions beyond the BLM's work. Forest Service plans might be the next land management agencies Congress attempt to disrupt using this process. This ultimately could lead to Washington micromanaging public lands rather than letting the people and experts that live near the forest, grasslands, and waterways have a say. So look at who is concerned about what's happening in the Senate today, the groups that are supportive of what I've been talking about here and are against this effort. American Fisheries Society, American Fly Fishing Trade Association, American Hunters and Anglers, Angler Action Foundation, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, Bass Anglers Sportsman Society, Bass Fly Fishers International, the Isaac Walton League of America, Minnesota Trout Unlimited, Minnesota Wildlife Federation, National Deer Association, National Wildlife Federation, North American Falconers Association, North American Grouse Partnership, Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever, Sportsmen for the Boundary Waters, Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, Trout Unlimited, Whitetails Unlimited, Wildlife Management Institute, the American Canoe Association, the Outdoor Alliance, Outdoor Life, Outdoor Realtor. So maybe some time should be taken to listen to what some of these national groups are saying that care about what my grandpa and my dad cared about, and that is public lands that can be used for recreation, for canoeing, for hunting, and for fishing. So I'll end with this, Mr. President. Sigurd Olson, the great Ely, Minnesota author and conservationist, wrote, that joys come from simple and natural things: mists over meadows, sunlights on leaves, the path of the moon over water. This is the Boundary Waters. So Sigurd Olson just happened to be the dean of Ely Junior College, and yet he rose to this national fame. And that's when my dad met him, because my dad went to a 2-year college, Ely Junior College, because my grandma believed that somehow that would launch his career in journalism. She happened to be right, but no one would have believed it then. But Sigurd Olson was then the college dean. My dad and Sigurd Olson maintained a friendship for many years, powered by their shared love for the written word, for the Boundary Waters, and for their efforts to preserve Minnesota's forests and parks. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter signed into law Hubert Humphrey's bill, and this is the desk that I stand at today, Hubert Humphrey's desk, to protect this area by creating the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. And now the Boundary Waters are now the most visited wilderness area in the country, welcoming 150,000 people each year. Over the course of my dad's career, he wrote 8,400 columns, more than a few of which were dispatches from the Boundary Waters. Speaking to the complexity of this national wonder, my dad wrote about the Boundary Waters, "This is a place of woods and lakes and repose most of the time, where a person can roam or drift or watch and listen, and that is not so much different in winter than in summer." He called it 1,000,000 acres of waterway and forest, unlike any in the United States. And my grandpa, who loved that area, loved the forest, understood that you can make both things work. But not when you're messing around with rules, not when you're not even taking the time to look at what's happening here to our public lands, and instead are just making this decision at night and going home for the day. I thank Senator Smith for her work, and I ask my colleagues to vote with us and listen to us about what's going on here. Thank you. I yield the floor.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Klobuchar, you and I have known each other for many years, and I never knew that your father was friends and colleagues with Sigurd Olson, which is really incredible. He is such a storyteller of this particular part, this amazing, beautiful part of the world. So thank you for sharing that. And also thank you for the incredible representation that you have provided to northern Minnesota and all of Minnesota for so many years. Your deep roots in Minnesota's Iron Range it gives you so much credibility across the state, and particularly on this issue. So thank you. And Mr. President, I would believe that Senator Baldwin wants to say something.
Thank you for your leadership, Senator Smith. And I also want to note the powerful words that Senator Klobuchar just shared. She took me down memory lane as we remember conservationists and folks that came from our states. And just earlier today, I was noting with my staff that next week we'll be commemorating the 56th anniversary of Earth Day, the first Earth Day. And it was Gaylord Nelson, a senator in this body, who brought forth the whole concept of respecting the earth and celebrating with a day focused on celebration of the earth. Wisconsin was also home for large portions of their lives, Aldo Leopold and John Muir. And hearing those accounts makes me feel especially humbled and honored to rise to speak to this resolution, this joint resolution that is before the Senate right now that we really must defeat. I want to share with my colleagues what is at stake if the Senate removes protections from the Boundary Waters. The Boundary Waters Wilderness Area is one of the most pristine freshwater systems in the entire country. And if these protections are rolled back and mining moves forward, there is no restoring. There's no restoration of this watershed. It will be risking permanent damage for the profits of a multi-billion-dollar foreign mining company, and I'll return to that in a moment. We must recognize who will be most affected by revoking the protections that have been in place for decades and for good reason. Tribal nations in this region have lived with and depended upon the boundary waters for generations. These lands are sacred to the Ojibwe people. Tribes have treaty rights to hunt, to fish, and to gather. Voting for this resolution would betray our centuries-old treaties between the United States and the Chippewa of Lake Superior. We cannot say that we respect tribal sovereignty while undermining the very resources that those rights depend upon. There is a reason that the Boundary Waters is also America's most popular and water-rich wilderness area. Its 1.1 million acres contain more than 1,000 pristine lakes and 1,200 miles of river and stream. Voting for this resolution risks the destruction of the region's prized natural resources, where the wild rice beds and fisheries are thriving, and the water is clean and safe to drink. People come from all over this country to recreate on the Boundary Waters, fish in the lakes, hunt in the forests. Before my colleagues vote to greenlight a mining operation, I urge them to come see the beauty and the magic of the Boundary Waters. I have done so. It was an amazing experience. And I've heard from so many Wisconsinites who've shared their stories, their memories, and they cannot fathom the idea that Congress would take the step that we're on the precipice of taking. As well, I've heard from our 11 federally recognized tribal nations and their strong opposition. Our waters, our rivers, our lakes are all a part of the way of life in the Midwest. They provide fresh drinking water. They are endless sources of recreation, and they bring tourism to our states. You know, this area in particular generates over $900 million in annual tourism revenue and sustains roughly 17,000 jobs. Rural towns across the region depend on the protection of the wilderness area and its natural resources. Family-owned small businesses that provide guiding and fishing and outdoor recreation will not survive if the water is polluted and the wilderness is degraded. The Boundary Waters must not be put at risk of perpetual pollution, which is what this resolution would do. I also just want to make it clear to my colleagues who actually stands to benefit if this resolution passes the Senate. While we have heard that rolling back protections for the Boundary Waters would bring economic opportunities for the region, that is false. The profits from the mining contract that this resolution aims to fast track are ultimately going overseas to benefit a Chilean multinational organization and China's industrial supply chain. That's right, after enabling the destruction of one of our most pristine natural resources, those very resources are expected to be sold to China. With this resolution, the majority will be cashing out on a mining deal that has no long-term benefit to our economy or workforce. The short-term gain of a mining contract cannot compete with the benefits of protecting the region that already generates, as I said earlier, over $900 million annually in tourism revenue and sustains nearly 17,000 jobs. This resolution does not invest in the future of communities across the Boundary Waters, nor does it respect the treaties with our tribal nations. Its passage would come at public expense, while the profits from the project flow to foreign corporations. I invite my colleagues who have never yet made it to the Boundary Waters to come and experience it for yourself. I encourage you to meet with the tribes and small businesses in the region and see for yourself what we stand to lose. And I implore my colleagues not to jeopardize the future of one of the most pristine freshwater ecosystems in America and override tribal rights. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this resolution, and I yield.
Mr. President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to just thank my colleague from Wisconsin for her powerful words and her longtime support for the Boundary Waters and for treaty rights and for American jobs and American-made products. And so I just so greatly appreciate you being here today and in support of this, and appreciate very much. I also really appreciate my colleague, Senator Heinrich from New Mexico, being here today as well to talk about how important this is and why this matters so much to him. I know Senator Heinrich is planning a trip to the Boundary Waters this summer, and we'll all be able to hear stories of that when you get back. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield.
Senator from New Mexico.
Well, I want to thank my colleague from Minnesota for her endless advocacy for this special place, one of America's true gems. And I do hope to make it to the Boundary Waters this summer. Last July, I was supposed to be in the Boundary Waters. I had long planned a trip with my family. It was to be our first time exploring the Boundary Waters. My family made it. I did not. My wife, Julie, my sons, Mike and Carter, had an incredible time that they will always remember. They paddled their canoes across lakes. They portaged from lake to lake. They slept under a blanket of stars that most people in Washington, D.C. could never imagine because they can't see it. And I was supposed to be part of that trip. I was stuck here fighting to strip out the public land sell-off language from the Republican budget bill. They sent me lots of pictures afterwards, pictures of the northern pike here that my son caught, my son Micah. My wife, Julie, was able to spend some really quality wilderness time with both of our sons before they went off to their respective colleges for the year. She basically told me that they ate more food on this trip than most rugby teams. And like my family, millions, literally millions of Americans have hunted and fished and paddled and traversed the Boundary Waters. And in fact, it has an almost religious connotation among sportsmen in particular. And it's somewhat amazing to me to see a Republican Party that used to have such fidelity to hunters and anglers basically roll all of the organizations that my colleague from Minnesota rattled off who said this is not the right place for this. Organizations like Pheasants Forever and Backcountry Hunters and Anglers and Teddy Roosevelt Conservation Partnership and on and on and on. But that's where we are today. You know, stories from the Boundary Waters, stories of stalking whitetail and grouse are passed down from generation to generation in the Midwest. Legendary stories of lake trout and northern pike and walleye abound, sometimes with the fish actually getting bigger with each telling of the story. And the water, as the senator from Minnesota, Senator Smith, said, is some of the cleanest you will find anywhere in the lower 48. It is a bucket list, once-in-a-lifetime destination for so many public landowners. And that is precisely what's at risk with this vote. One of our nation's true crown jewels. So let's back up a little bit for folks who don't have a firsthand knowledge of what the Boundary Waters is, where it is, and do a little explaining. That the Boundary Waters is one of the most incredible, intact wilderness landscapes left in our nation. It is an absolute tapestry of lakes and streams consisting of well over 1,000 individual lakes, 2,000 designated campsites, hundreds of miles of rivers and streams. The Boundary Waters contain the largest contiguous landscape of uncut forest remaining in the eastern United States. And the 3 million acre Superior National Forest in which the Boundary Water sits contains fully 20% of all the fresh water in the entire National Forest system. An incredible figure. And in fact, this wilderness was so important that Teddy Roosevelt himself, President Roosevelt, set it aside as part of the Superior National Forest all the way back in 1909. Almost half a century later, Congress voted overwhelmingly to include the Boundary Waters as one of the original units of the national wilderness system. And in many ways, Minnesotans rely on the Boundary Waters to support their local economy. Every year, the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness draws more visitors than any other wilderness area in the entire nation. This recreation supports 17,000 Minnesotan jobs, and it contributes roughly $1 billion in annual sales and preserves and shares, more importantly, a way of life that has been passed down from generation to generation. And this is an area that is no stranger to threats. In addition to containing so many of the natural resources that come with the wilderness, the area also contains copper. And I should say, for one, there's a long history of iron mining in this area. And I grew up the son of someone who worked for Anaconda Copper, the grandson of somebody who was a gold miner. But I want to talk a little bit about the difference between some of these iron range mines that mine ore that is just chemically inert. It is chemically stable. When you mine for iron, you're basically mining iron oxide, you're mining rust, and then you're turning that back into iron. This is not that kind of mine. This is a copper sulfide mine, and the company that wants to mine here, called Twin Metals, and that sounds so Minnesotan. I think they might have picked it to sound Minnesotan. It's actually a subsidiary of a Chilean mining company called Antofagasta. They want to build this copper nickel mine less than a mile upstream from the Boundary Waters on a spit of land between two waterways. And let me explain a little bit about what it looks like to mine copper in a place like the Boundary Waters, and particularly when you're mining copper sulfide ore. The company will have to dig some very deep shafts to reach these very deep ore bodies. They will then remove many millions of tons for processing, millions and millions of tons of copper sulfur ore. And after they remove what copper and nickel is economically recoverable in that ore, they will dump as much as 100 million tons of waste rock and low-grade ore on the site, never to be removed. Now, deep underground, the copper, it's locked up in this ore rich in sulfur. But that ore has never been exposed to water. It's never been exposed to oxygen or air. And when you bring it to the surface and you let it sit out in a pile and you expose it to air and water, oxygen bonds with that sulfur. And when you bond oxygen to sulfur, you get sulfuric acid. Sulfuric acid is one of the hardest waste products you can imagine to try and control. The waste rock that has been dumped on the site will naturally form sulfuric acid. That acid will then dissolve toxic heavy metals present in the waste rock. And then you have this toxic stew of heavy metals along with sulfuric acid. Now, there's no plan to remove all this waste from the mine site. So it's basically a ticking time bomb of acid and heavy metals. Studies by the EPA say that the odds of sulfuric acid polluting the boundary waters under this scenario is highly likely. And I'll do you one better. It has a perfect track record of polluting water. That is according to the peer-reviewed study on sulfide ore copper mining that drove the 2023 decision to ban mining in the area. It's also my personal experience as a former natural resources trustee who had to negotiate with copper companies who polluted water with the same technology. So it's not just highly likely, it is guaranteed. Sulfide mining in the Rainy River watershed will cause certain irreversible pollution to the boundary waters. Think again about eating those fish that you caught or drinking that water that you dipped from the middle of the lake. Because the thing about sulfuric acid poisoning is it's invisible. You can't see it, but it makes water unsafe to drink. Sulfuric acid also lowers the pH level of water, changing entire ecosystems. At high levels, fish that rely on healthy water to live literally experience respiratory failure in water poisoned by sulfuric acid. They literally drown to death. They'll not be able to reproduce normally. Their food sources will be tainted, meaning entire fish populations of lake trout and smallmouth bass are at risk. The sulfuric acid produced by this mine will leach heavy metals like lead or mercury or copper into that same water. That will then accumulate in the bodies of fish and wildlife that consume that water. And when people eat meat and fish with heavy metals, they accumulate in our bodies too. This isn't a myth, it's a virtually guaranteed outcome. Because we know that plans for the mine include storing over 100 million tons of waste rock, of toxic waste rock on the edge of the wilderness, upstream of the boundary waters. Think about how much that is. Let's visualize how much waste rock we're talking about being dumped and never removed from this mine site. 100 million tons is like 740,000 Boeing 777 airplanes. It's twice the mass of all the living people on Earth. It's 500 times the weight of the Empire State Building sitting there generating toxic acid. And it's the amount of toxic waste that Antofagasta, a foreign mining company that plans to sell the copper to foreign countries, plans to store on the edge of the largest patch of wild rivers and forests in our country, the place that has 20% of all the fresh water in our national forest system. The damage is really unthinkable, but it's also irreversible because currently we don't have any technology available that is capable of reversing sulfuric acid contamination. This is bad. It's so bad that in 2016, even before there was a mineral withdrawal, the Obama administration canceled the mine's lease. And in 2023, after years of review and overwhelming public support, a 20-year mineral withdrawal was established in the Rainy River watershed, home to the boundary waters. And that decision reflects common sense. Some places are too valuable to gamble with. With today's technology, if it's a gamble, why not wait 30 years when maybe that technology is a sure bet, but it's not a sure bet today. That decision also reflected the voices of the American people because the assessment that led to the mineral withdrawal was completed by the U.S. Forest Service in 2022, and it included hundreds of thousands of public comments, 675,000 public comments, over 95% of which favored the withdrawal area being withdrawn from non-ferrous mining, sulfide mining. Today, 70% of Minnesotans oppose mining in the boundary waters. And instead of listening to Minnesotans and Americans from all over the country who care about this place, Republicans today are using an unprecedented, blunt force legislative method that includes zero public comment, no comment period, to make decisions about our public lands without any input from the people to whom those lands actually belong. And we can't talk about the boundary waters without also speaking of belonging and tribal communities. 3 tribes, the Bois Forte Band, the Fond du Lac Band, and the Grand Portage Band of Chippewa, have extensive treaty rights in northeastern Minnesota. These are rights to do things like hunt and fish and gather wild rice. These rights are guaranteed to them by the 1854 Treaty of La Pointe and have been reaffirmed by federal courts over and over again. By overturning the public land order with a CRA resolution, Senate Republicans will not only cut tribes out of the conversation, but they disrespect the tribal treaty rights and directly risk those tribes' guaranteed access to their traditional way of life and subsistence use of this place. So since my Republican colleagues are refusing to include constituents' voices in this process, I'll bring a few of those from New Mexico to the floor here today. Dr. Brown from Santa Fe wrote me in urging that we oppose this vote. He said, "I canoed the boundary waters many times and can attest to its uniqueness. With some of the purest water in the United States, these lakes are visited and admired by thousands of Americans. Pollution of the boundary waters would be a tragedy for the nation and the world." Dr. Merriman from Albuquerque said, "Please vote no on HRES 140. Some things are worth more than money." Lee in Los Alamos wrote, "I am writing to you to ask you to oppose HRES 140. The Boundary Waters Canoe area is a national treasure, not just for Minnesotans, but for me and other New Mexicans as well." Naima in Santa Fe said, "This is a hideous giveaway to corporate profiteers and cannot stand. Please vote no." From Dr. Bagney in Silver City, any short-term economic benefits would clearly not outweigh the long-term risks to the ecosystem and water supplies. Although it is in Minnesota, many similar public lands in New Mexico could be threatened by relaxing mining rules. Please oppose. Judy in Albuquerque wrote, "I am aghast. Please do all that you can to stop this giveaway of our wonderful public lands. This happened despite all of the thousands of citizen signatures against the vote." From Roxanne in Rio Rancho, "Please vote against reversing the ban on mining. I am very concerned that the Trump administration is flying under the radar and doing a lot of damage that will be difficult or even impossible to reverse." Amy in Albuquerque, "Please do not allow this to happen. The boundary waters belong to all Americans, not to a Chilean mining company with contracts to process ore in China." Their voices matter because the boundary waters are our public lands, all of ours. President Teddy Roosevelt, who had the incredible foresight to protect this beautiful place, he had it right when he said, "We should see to it that they are preserved for our children and our children's children forever, with their majestic beauty all unmarred." The way I look at public lands is that they are the closest, most tangible thing we have to being able to represent true Jeffersonian democracy. They are the thing, as we saw last June, that often unites us across the political spectrum. If you take these public lands away, you tear away the places where we are most free. This is an issue of heritage. It's an issue of our inheritance. And it's an issue for Minnesota, but it's not just an issue for Minnesota. It is an issue for our nation. It's about something bigger. It's a test of whether our public lands, a friend of mine likes to say, our public lands that are the anvil upon which we have forged our collective identity. Can that be stripped from us? Can it be stripped of their protections? You know, I'm going to summarize this one more time. We're going to allow a foreign mining company to take our minerals, to ship those minerals to China for processing, and then sell those back to us with a tariff on top. Like, how is that America first? It's not. And to risk this globally incredible, rare asset that is the boundary waters, for that, boy, that just seems really short-sighted to me. And I would urge every one of my colleagues, I would urge you to vote no on this Congressional Review Act resolution.
Mr. President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I want to thank my colleague from New Mexico for laying out the issues that are before us with this House resolution on the boundary waters so ably. And it's wonderful to have a colleague who not only is really good at being a legislator, but also is an outstanding hunter and fisherman. And then on top of that is also an engineer, so he can explain to us the impacts of this kind of mining on the environment with a scientific expertise that I just really value. So thank you so much, Senator Heinrich, for being here tonight to help tell the story of what the impact of this mine would be on this incredible place and why it's so important that the CRA be defeated. As I think about what I want people to know about this place, I can't help but think about the first time that I saw the boundary waters myself. Some of my colleagues may know that I was originally born in New Mexico. I've lived in Minnesota for over 40 years now, but I was originally born in New Mexico, and New Mexico is a desert climate. And so when I first came to Minnesota, I didn't quite know what to make of all the lakes and rivers and streams and the beautiful green everywhere. But I was married to a man who had spent his high school years up in the boundary waters, and he went to a camp up there where he would go up for weeks at a time and canoe throughout the boundary waters. And the boundary waters are connected to a big Canadian provincial park called the Quetico, and you literally can canoe from surface water in the boundary waters and get all the way to Hudson's Bay, which is just remarkable. I went up there for the first time to see this incredible place after Archie and I had lived in Minnesota for a few years, and I think in a lot of ways is when I first fell in love with Minnesota, the place of Minnesota, because I just couldn't believe all the water and the green and the wildlife, and also how wild it was. To be able to be out on the water in a canoe and feel like you were just so far away from the pressures of modern civilization. And yet, the boundary waters is really quite accessible to people. It is not one of those places that is a wilderness area that is impossible to get to, which is why, as we're talking about tonight, people have been, hundreds of thousands of people are able to visit the boundary waters each year and be able to experience what it's like to be in this place. As I said earlier, the last time I was there was at the end of last summer, and we were in the boundary waters just for a day trip. And even on that day trip, we saw 2 wolves, which is like really incredible. You can imagine in the wintertime when it's so dark in that part of the world, long nights, the opportunity to see the aurora borealis, the Northern Lights is just really phenomenal. And in the summertime, the long northern summer evenings stretch on until 9:30 or 10 at night, and you have incredible opportunities to go fishing and just be at the camp and just enjoy it. It's really amazing. When I first went to the Boundary Waters with our kids, I started to get really interested in the history of this place, and I found it just fascinating to think about. So you've got, what today we think of as the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, which is 1 million acres of protected wilderness. But it's important, I think, as I was diving into the history of this place, to understand that historically this has been the home of the Anishinaabe people, Ojibwe people in northern Minnesota. They lived in this place for generations and generations. They canoed and hunted and fished to support themselves and their families and their communities, and that was their home. Starting in the 18th century, the Boundary Waters got connected up through the fur trade routes as the voyageurs came, across all the way from across the Atlantic and then in through, what is now northern Minnesota and Canada. But it was at that point this just incredible resource for these fur trading routes that were a hugely big deal. That fur trade really drove what was happening in that part of the country in the 1700s and 1800s. French explorers and traders, they really opened up the area. The Northwest Company established a trading post at Grand Portage, and that was really kind of the economic driver. And in this moment, this part of the country that is now the Boundary Waters experienced huge transitions. But I think it's important for us all to understand that even though this is a wilderness place, it is a wild place, it has also always been a place where people were a part of what was happening in this country, and in this particular part of the country. Of course, over time, as the United States became a country and entered into relationships with the tribal nations that lived in this part of the country, that became sort of what drove a lot of the geopolitics, I guess you could say, of this part of the nation. In 1857, there was an enabling act of the United States Congress which granted land to support schools through the University of Minnesota. And then a little bit later, this is right about the time of the statehood for Minnesota. Minnesota was admitted into the Union in 1858. There was additional negotiating that happened, and Congress granted the right to the state to swap lands in order to pull big chunks of land together. By the time of about 1902, the U.S. Lands Office it withdrew 500,000 acres in what is now the future, what is the future BWCAW wilderness area, and they withdrew it from settlement, which was a really important thing, because at this time we were seeing massive development in northern Minnesota. Huge, massive timber resources were present in the state, and of course mineral resources, including iron. In 1904, at the request of the State Forestry Board, Congress granted 20,000 acres to the state for the Burnside Forest Reserve, and said in that situation that state forest reserves should be devoted not alone to the business of raising timber, but to the pleasures of all the people. It's interesting to me, I think about how Minnesota was, even back more than a century ago, was thinking carefully about how to balance the power and the vitality of our economy in northern Minnesota, with also the understanding that some of that most precious land needs to be set aside in a place where people can enjoy it. Over time, in 1909, the Superior National Forest was created by President Theodore Roosevelt, a great conservationist in our country's history. I often think of him as the man who really was the leader of the powerful Republican conservation movement in this country. So in 1909, President Theodore Roosevelt created the Superior National Forest, which from previously withdrawn lands that had been set aside, including what is now part of the Boundary Waters Canoe area. There was continuing work both at the state level and at the federal level to create sort of game refuges and other places that would be a place where the incredible resources of the moose and caribou and other wild creatures would have a place to live, even as northern Minnesota was becoming increasingly developed. In 1926, the roadless wilderness area in the Superior National Forest was established by the Secretary of Agriculture at the time. That was 640,000 acres. And at that point they said the policy here is to retain as much as possible of the land which has recreational opportunities of this nature in the wilderness. The efforts of this country to continue to protect this area went forward in the 1930s with passage of the Shipstead-Newton-Nolan Act to protect water levels and lake shores. There had been some dams and other sort of navigational structures that had been built that was having an impact on how the water flowed in the Boundary Waters. And so here we had kind of a prohibition of those dams and logging within 400 feet of this recreational area to sort of protect the natural area. And then in the late 1920s and early 1930s, work continued to sort of establish what was this special place that was going to be protected. In 1938, the U.S. Forest Service established the Superior Roadless Primitive Area with boundaries that are today quite similar to what today is the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. In Minnesota, we know a lot about something called Tyblatnik. I can talk more about that, but in 1948, Congress passed the Tyblatnik area. And what happened then is that through the Tyblatnik area Act, resorts and other private lands in the wilderness were bought up, and we established something that is still very important to this day, something that I work on all the time, that in lieu of the property taxes that might have been achieved through those lands, there is a payment in lieu of taxes called Tyblatnik that goes to the counties up in northern Minnesota, Cook County and Lake County, St. Louis County, in exchange for what was this wilderness area for all of us to enjoy. In 1949, President Truman issued an executive order for basically an airspace reservation over the wilderness area to prohibit planes from flying in on the lakes and disrupting the experience of nature that people could have there. You were not allowed to fly lower than 4,000 feet over the wilderness. And then in 1958, the Forest Service changes the name of this place to the Boundary Waters Canoe Area, and it becomes a part of what we now know as the Boundary Waters. In 1964, another really important milestone happened for the protection of this incredible place, and that was when Congress passed the Wilderness Act, and the Boundary Waters Canoe Area became part of the National Wilderness Preservation System, with a clause that allowed for some logging and some use of motorized vehicles to continue in this area. In 1965, the Secretary of Agriculture at the time was Orville Freeman, who was a Minnesotan, and Secretary Freeman issued all sorts of management changes that were recommended to kind of further protect this area from logging and from motorized boats and zoning to make sure that it would stay in its most natural state. In 1978, Congress enacts the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness Act. which eliminated, which protected this place in perpetuity, we would hope, for to be the wilderness area that it is. This was a very, very important thing. It was somewhat controversial in Minnesota at the time, there is no doubt, but it has today become one of the most beloved places in Minnesota, thanks to the prescience of state and local leaders who went forward to protect this place. And I'm thinking, as I think about all of the people over so many generations who have been in this place for sustenance, for their food, for their housing, and in more modern times for their ability to get away from it all and to enjoy this place in ways that is so difficult. I'm thinking about all the people that I have heard from who have asked me to make sure that we're protecting this place. I think today, with a big thanks to everybody who's reached out to our office, I think today we had hundreds of phone calls into the office asking me to do everything I can to protect the Boundary Waters wilderness area. And honestly, over the last many weeks that this issue has been on the forefront of people's minds, we have gotten, I'm sure, just thousands and thousands and thousands of messages from people. And what's interesting about these messages is, one, how many people have firsthand experience of this incredible place and what it means to them, and just the diversity of the stories that people have. I find this all the time when I go around Minnesota, and people will stop me and thank me for the work that I have done to protect this place, just the way that people want to tell the stories of what it has meant to them. I think today, especially in this time when it is so hard, especially for our young people, to get, all of us, however old you are, to get away from technology and to just sort of be centered in that experience of being, out in nature. It is causing people to be even more appreciative of what it means to have a wilderness area like this. So I'm going to just take a moment to read some of the stories that have been forwarded to me about the power of this place and the lives of people in Minnesota and across the country. This is a story from Grand Rapids, Minnesota, which is in the kind of northern part of the state, still south of the Boundary Waters. And it says, I am a 53-year-old that has lived in northern Minnesota her whole life. My family and I have enjoyed God's great North Woods and all it has to offer through canoeing and camping, water skiing, biking, campfires, hiking, swimming, and much more. To see and hear about the Boundary Waters possibly being condemned would be beyond a travesty. Just think, all of the animals, all of the family trips ended, tree growth, the disaster that would happen there, not to mention what it would do to the ecosystem and whatever else I cannot fathom right now. This is a message that was sent into me from Matamidi, Minnesota, which is more in the Twin Cities, south central part of the state, in the Twin Cities area. This person wrote, "The Boundary Waters have been a very special place to me for a long time. I was first taken there by my father and my uncle, and it was the start of my relationship with my uncle, who was previously more distant from our family due to work. Since then, I have gone to the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness once a year for the past few years with my father and my uncle. So many of my fondest memories are all from the Boundary Waters, and I hope to continue to make more of them, not only with my father and my uncle, but with my own children in the future as well." This is a message from someone from Farmington, Minnesota. Farmington is also in the kind of suburban metro area of Minneapolis and St. Paul. And this person said, "Me and my dad take a trip once yearly to canoe the Boundary Waters. I am 23 years old, and every year is incredibly special because the Boundary Waters are so important to my family. My dad proposed to my mom in the Boundary Waters. The Boundary Waters represents love, the wild, untamed American spirit and my family. I want to be able to show my children pristine wilderness. I am begging you to act to protect the boundary waters. This is a message from Rochester, Minnesota, the home of Mayo Clinic and University of Minnesota Rochester, an incredible community. This person has written this. I was 10 years old when I first visited the boundary waters with my dad and my grandfather. I have since visited numerous times, including in 2020 when my grandfather, who had been going to the boundary waters for 40 years, made his final visit. This place is now to my family not just a tranquil retreat, but also a time-honored family legacy and an act of remembrance for my grandfather. To allow the boundary waters to be permanently open for mining is to destroy one of the great natural gifts God has given Minnesota for current generations and generations to come. Now, I just want to pause on this because I think it's an opportunity to talk a little bit more about kind of help to locate in colleagues, in people's brains, like where this mine will be. And I have a map which shows how this all flows. So the boundary waters is this huge area, as we've said, 1 million acres of wilderness. And I'm going to orient you here. The green here is the boundary waters Canoe area wilderness. And this is the border between Minnesota and Canada here. And this is the Quetico Provincial Park, which is this huge Canadian national park. It's really quite incredible. And then here you see Ely, Minnesota, which is a major entry point into the boundary waters. If you were to go over here, you would find, or I guess it's down here as I'm orienting myself on this map, you would see there's another, I guess it's over here, there's another access point that is commonly used by people in going into the boundary waters through the Gunflint Trail and Grand Marais, which is right here on Lake Superior. And what we're talking about here you can see, I'm going to give you the orientation here. The red area, this area here, this yellow and green stripes, which you can see here, this is where the Twin Metals deposits are, this mine that we're talking about. This is the deposits that would be developed by Antofagasta, by the Twin Metals mine, right here. The blue area the red area shows how the water flows on the map, and it gives you an idea of why, even though this mine is just slightly outside of the actual boundaries of the boundary waters, that for the practical purposes of the watershed and how the water moves, it might as well be inside the watershed in terms of how the damage to the water would flow, because you can see it's all connected. I mean, that's what happens with water; it flows. And so here you have Birch Lake. It flows up this way. This is the Namakan River, Namakan Lake. Up here is Rainy Lake. This is where close to where our kids went to camp. Cabatagama Lake is up here. All of this area is connected. And so when you hear colleagues, people telling you, you don't need to worry about this because this mine isn't in the boundary waters, that is not the point. The point is that it is in the watershed of the boundary waters, and that is how the damage is done.
Mr. President, I ask consent that Senator Smith's remarks appear uninterrupted in the record.
Senator from Nebraska is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask the unanimous consent that the Senator Smith's remarks appear uninterrupted in the record.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Committee on the Judiciary be discharged, and the Senate now proceed to the consideration of S-Res 627.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 627 designating March 5th, 2026 as National Slam the Scam Day and so forth.
Without objection, the committee is discharged, and the Senate will proceed.
I ask that unanimous consent that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motion be to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of SRES 673, which is at the desk.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 673, supporting the goals and ideals of National Safe Digging Month.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions be to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Small Business and the Entrepreneurship be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 2066 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report.
H.R. 2066, an act to amend the Small Business Investment Act of 1958 and so forth, and for other purposes.
Without objection, the committee is discharged,
I ask unanimous
and the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business here today, it stands in recess until 10 a.m. on Thursday, April 16th, that following the prayer and the pledge, the journal of the proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and the Senate resume consideration of H.J. Res. 140, and at 11 a.m., all time be expired on the joint resolution. It be read a third time, and the Senate vote on passage, and following disposition, the Senate proceed to executive session and resume consideration of calendar number 671, Andrew Davis, and notwithstanding Rule 22, the Senate vote on the motion to invoke cloture at 1:45 p.m. Further, if cloture is invoked, all time be expired, and the Senate vote on the confirmation at a time to be determined by the majority leader in consultation with the Democratic leader no earlier than Monday, April 20th.
Without objection.
If there is no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand in recess under the previous order following the remarks of Senator Smith.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
The senator from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was showing colleagues this map because I wanted to make a couple of points about how this works, how the water flow works. One is that even though the mineral deposits and how they're going to be developed are just barely outside of the Boundary Waters Canoe area, the impact of the mine and the impact on the water spreads not only through the boundary waters, but it also flows up through these rivers that essentially form the border between Minnesota and Canada, the United States and Canada, and then into Voyageurs National Park. I think sometimes we don't talk enough about the impact on Voyageurs, which is an incredible park. Together, Boundary Waters and Voyageurs offer people so many different ways of experiencing this wilderness, and the impact on both of them is really significant. I think sometimes also it's hard for folks to fully understand and appreciate, like, what is the impact on water quality of this kind of mine. And so I want to just share some of that with you as well as you think about, like, what is the risk that is actually posed by this. And I'm going to get into this a bit more in some detail, but I think it's important as you're considering this to understand that during the mineral lease withdrawal process that happened, stretched over time between roughly 2016 and 2021 when it was brought to conclusion, there was a massive amount of effort, scientific research, study that was done, huge amounts of public comment to gather information about what people thought about this that became the basis for the decision to do this mineral withdrawal. The mineral withdrawal process is defined in the Federal Land Management Policy Act, I believe is the FLPMA, as people call it around here, and that was followed to a T. And it allows, that law, written, that congressional law allows for mineral withdrawals when it is determined that the potential risks of mines or other kind of natural resources development pose too great a risk to the public resource that belongs to it all. So I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, but I wanted to just share with colleagues this background on why sulfide ore copper mining poses such a unique risk to the boundary waters of Minnesota. So the background here is that a Chilean mining company operating under the name of Twin Metals, Senator Heinrich said it sounds like a nice Minnesota name, and it is, but it is essentially a wholly owned subsidiary of Antofagasta. So this Chilean mining company has proposed this mine, a large copper nickel mine, immediately upstream of the boundary waters Canoe area wilderness. And this proposed mine would extract copper from a geological formation called the Duluth Complex. The Duluth Complex, really runs kind of this way. It runs from northeast to southwest across Minnesota. This is important because there are lots of places where the Duluth Complex can be developed in addition to this particular place where these leases in question are right on the border of the boundary waters. There's huge resources all across the way, and in fact there are other mines under development down in this part of the state that are going through the process of getting developed. But anyway, so this Duluth process, which has a specific type of sulfide ore that interacts with water in ways that can create, that do create permanent contamination risks. And so the question is, how does this mechanism work? What exactly happens? And why is this so particularly difficult to manage in this watershed? And part of why the water quality is of such a big concern in this area is that the baseline condition here is just so outstanding. A 2017 report by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency describes the water within the Boundary Waters watershed as exceptionally clean and immaculate, that's a quote, and concludes that the majority of the water bodies within this watershed have exceptional biological, chemical, and physical characteristics. So the water in the Boundary Waters is so clean that visitors frequently drink right out of the lakes. There's no need for any purification. I've done this myself when you're canoeing. Now you're not going to want to drink the water right next to the shore because that's where the wild animals are, but you can go out into the middle of the lake and dip your mug into the water in the middle of the lake, and the water is incredible. So the fundamental hazard here is the hazard of sulfide ore mining is this acid mine drainage that happens. When sulfide-bearing rock is excavated and exposed to oxygen and water, a chemical chain reaction begins. And what happens is that the sulfide minerals here, primarily, I might not say this exactly right, pyrrhotite, and which is in the Duluth Complex, it oxidizes upon exposure, and then you have sulfuric acid. And sulfuric acid then dissolves the surrounding rock and leaching out heavy metals, including copper and arsenic and lead and cadmium, into the water. And the resulting contaminated water, which is the acid mine drainage, is very acidic. And it is also laden with heavy metals, and that, of course, is toxic to aquatic life. And the mining operations are going to dramatically increase the surface area of this rock as it is exposed to water and oxygen, and that accelerates the oxidation by many orders of magnitude compared to what you would see with natural weathering rates. And once this process is started, once this acid mine drainage has started, it is incredibly difficult to stop it, and it can continue for centuries or in perpetuity after the mine closes, a problem that is sometimes called perpetual treatment. So, if you think about it, this mine, the mining company itself says that they think that the mine would probably be in operation for, I think, 10, 15 years, in that area. Yet you're going to have centuries of impact from this so-called perpetual treatment issue. Secondary chemical hazard, when you are doing sulfide ore mining in this particularly damp environment of the Boundary Waters watershed, that it would also substantially increase sulfite loading in the water. So elevated sulfate triggers a separate but related chemical reaction with serious consequences for human health. Sulfite-reducing bacteria and sediment can convert sulfate to sulfide under low oxygen conditions, and then the sulfide can react with inorganic mercury, which is naturally present in the environment, to produce methylmercury. And methylmercury bioaccumulates in the food chain, concentrating in fish at levels that can be dangerous for human consumption. Sulfate discharges from existing disturbed areas of sulfide ore in the watershed have already elevated sulfate levels in the BWCA headwaters, and analysis of monitoring data indicates that there's a measurable water quality degradation that is already occurring. So this is important because the Boundary Waters fisheries, particularly walleye, the most beloved fish in Minnesota, are central to the recreational and economic value of this place. And of course, mercury contamination resulting in consumption advisories would have a significant impact for the sport fishing industry, certainly for tribal subsistence rights, and overall for the negative impacts on the regional tourism economy. So I think as you think about this, you gotta sometimes think, wow, that sounds bad, but is that really gonna happen? Do we really have to worry about that? Won't there be a way of avoiding this? And I just wanna point out that we can look at the precedents of what has happened in other places around the country to help answer that question. The chemical risks that I've just described are not theoretical. In fact, there are 2 sites in the United States where this AMD from sulfide ore mining has caused serious and long-lasting harm. This is the this is the acid mine drainage, AMD. So the first site is the Gold King mine in Colorado. This is from 2015. In August of 2015, an EPA contractor crew working at the abandoned Gold King mine near Silverton, Colorado, accidentally breached a plug, releasing approximately 3 million gallons of acid mine drainage into Cement Creek, which is a tributary of the Animas River. So this plume, which was literally visible orange from dissolved iron and heavy metals, it traveled more than 100 miles downstream through Colorado and New Mexico. It crossed into the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation relies on the San Juan River for irrigation and for drinking water. And 3 states had to declare emergencies. The Navajo Nation had to shut down all water withdrawals from the river. Farmers lost crops and were forced to sell their livestock, and some metals were measured at hundreds of times the legal limits for drinking water. Now, a treatment plan costing $1.5 million to build, costing $1.5 million to build and $2.4 million per year to operate was still running as of 2024, 9 years after the spill. This treatment plant is treating an estimated 300 gallons of contaminated water per minute, draining continuously from the mine. Local communities have declined Superfund designation for years out of concern for tourism, but the spill forced their hand, and victims have filed hundreds of millions of dollars in claims. None has been paid because the EPA evoked sovereign immunity. So this was a breach in this gold medal mine in Silverton, talking about a plume of this polluted acid drainage that is traveling more than 100 miles. And I know my Minnesota pretty well, but I would say that, certainly from Birch Lake to Voyageurs National Park is less than 100 miles. So it gives you an idea of how far this polluted water can spread in this, these kinds of dangerous environments. I want to tell colleagues about another example of this kind of failure, and that is the Summitville mine in Colorado. At the Summitville gold mine in southern Colorado, acid and metal-laden runoff killed all biological life in a 17-mile stretch of the Alamosa River. The operator declared bankruptcy in 1992 and abandoned the site mid-operation, leaving EPA to manage the ongoing emergency. And the site was designated a federal Superfund site, and federal cleanup costs have exceeded $210 million. The Alamosa River has never fully recovered. I think it's important that we think about these things as we consider the risks of this kind of mine. And again, I want to remind colleagues that that's one of the reasons why this mineral withdrawal was done, because the Forest Service considered these risks. They did an environmental assessment, and they concluded that this risk was not, was too great to bear. When we weigh these substantial risks of mining near the boundary waters, it's important for us to ask, like, what is the benefit? What might we see here? Where might we benefit? And this is, I think, really important to understand, because where would these minerals go? There has been an argument made that this is an America First national security priority to develop these minerals. But the question is, who would own the minerals that are brought up from this piece of land right here near Birch Lake in northern Minnesota? And the answer to that question is these minerals are going to go to China. Antofagasta, the Chilean company that is wanting to develop these leases, operates a number of copper mines in South America, and it sends the majority of the ore that it pulls out of the ground to Chinese state-owned refineries for processing. This year, in fact, these Chinese refineries have agreed to an unprecedented $0 contract for processing Antofagasta ore. So if you think about it, what this means is that China is in such great need of copper ore to develop their energy and their AI infrastructure and all of the reasons that they need copper ore, that they have agreed to directly subsidize Antofagasta's copper production by providing free processing of its ore. So what this means, of course, is the copper, nickel that is pulled out of these deposits is going to probably travel by train to the Pacific coast, where it's then going to be transported to China, where it will be smelted in China, and it will be used. It's not that those minerals aren't going to then be sent back to us free. They're going to be, maybe at best, sold back to us in iPhones or other kinds of consumer products, but they're not ours to develop. We're going to have to buy them back. So I question, colleagues, what is the advantage here? Where is the national security advantage? Where is the America First advantage that we're looking for when with a critical minerals trade war already underway? Shipping American minerals to China seems to run counter to so much of the work that Congress is trying to do to onshore critical minerals and critical mineral supply chains. So I think that this shows, as I've been looking at this, I think it shows us that the proposed risks of this mine are substantial. They arise from the chemistry of the ore itself, and specifically the chemistry in this very particular climate. And here, the particular rock and the particular climate in Minnesota, you've got the inevitability of AMD, this acid mine drain off from this sulfide-rich rock. You have the absence of any natural acid buffering capacity in the watershed, and then you have this sort of sulfate-driven methylmercury pathway that's developed. These chemical realities, combined with the connectivity of this water across so many miles between the mine site and the mine site here, the BWCAW immediately adjacent to it, and then all of this watershed means that the consequences of contamination would be really severe, they would be long-lasting, and they would be effectively irreversible. And as we consider the risks that come from this mine proposal, I think we really have to ask ourselves if it is worth endangering one of our most beloved wilderness areas so that American minerals can be processed and used in China. Now, colleagues, I want to turn to an issue that is a little bit geeky and nerdy. If you're in Congress, though, you appreciate the value of it. And this has to do with sort of what is the process that we're using right here, right now, to pass this, this CRA. And let me just kind of talk about that a little bit, because I think it's important for us to understand the precedent that we will be setting if we pass this resolution. So we have before us House Joint Resolution 140, which would essentially apply the Congressional Review Authority process, with all of the privileges of that process, to something that is not a rule, which is what the Congressional Review Authority is all about, but is a public land order. And this is important to understand. The mineral withdrawal that was done here was done under the authorities of the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, which is, and in that Federal Land Policy and Management Act, there are processes that Congress defined for, if they don't like what happened, if they don't like what the executive branch did, there's processes for congressional disapproval of a public land order. And so under this Federal Land Policy and Management Act, I'm going to call it FLPMA because that's what everyone calls it around here, there's an existing process for Congress to express its disapproval with a public land order, like the 2023 mineral withdrawal, which is under consideration here on the Senate floor tonight. And in that process that's described, Congress is given 90 days to adopt a concurrent resolution of disapproval. So what's interesting is that following the 2023 mineral withdrawal, which was done, completed in 2023, a resolution of disapproval on that mineral withdrawal was actually introduced. It was introduced on the House floor, and it passed out of the House Natural Resources Committee, all done sort of under the rules of the of sort of what FLPMA establishes. But it was never brought to the House floor. It was never brought to the Senate floor. And in fact, Congress never acted on it. And what happened, of course, is under FLPMA, you have 90 days to review or disapprove of an action, and that 90-day window opened and closed, and it passed. But so now, what's happening? You might be asking, well, so like, why are we dealing with this now? This was in 2023. It actually came up on the House floor, and nothing ever came of it. Why are we dealing with this now? Well, so the reason for that is that Republicans in the House are trying to use the Congressional Review Authority to basically to get a do-over. They're ignoring the fact that the congressional CRA wasn't created to overturn a public land order, especially one that was 3 years old. The CRA was designed by Congress to say, if the federal government passes a rule that we don't like, within 60 days, we have the right to say, nope, that's not what we meant. We want to draw it back again. But of course, that's not what's going on here. We're talking about not 60 days, not 90 days. We're talking about 3 years. We're not talking about a federal regulation. We're talking about a public land order that has been standing for 3 years. And I just think we have to think about, like, what are the impacts of this precedent if this is the step that the Senate decides to take? Because if we're allowing these public land orders to be rescinded under the Congressional Review Act, I mean, this is a really dangerous precedent. Public land orders have never previously been submitted by any administration, including the first Trump administration. They've never previously been submitted as rules subject to the Congressional Review Authority. This is the first one. It's submitted 3 years after the public land order was issued by the Department of the Interior. And in fact, as I've just said, Congress set up a completely different set of procedures specifically to reconsider public land orders under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. So what we're seeing here is using the CRA to undo this public land order would establish an entirely new precedent. It would allow future Congresses to undo public land orders with no time limit on any public land order. And potentially, based on this precedent, it could allow future Congresses with a simple partisan majority vote to undo any administrative action. So what would that look like? What would that mean? Because I think as we're making this decision, college, you always have to think about sometimes you're in power, sometimes you're out of power, but you have to think about what are the long-term implications of your decisions. So if this precedent is set, if we say, yep, CRA can be used to undo a public land order like we have here in the boundary waters, well, then I would think that as some future Democratic Congress might think, let's use the CRA to undo a fossil fuel lease or a mining lease or a timber lease that we don't think makes sense in South Dakota. Maybe we could use, this precedent would suggest that you could use the CRA to undo a permit or undo a permit denial. In fact, it seems so broad, this precedent, that it could probably undo any determination on an administrative law matter. So that seems to me to be really risky because one of the things that matters in this country is you might not always agree with what happens, but there has to be some continuity, some consistency. If we're constantly doing something and then undoing it and then doing it again, I mean, I can tell you from my business background that that's a disaster, because how do you decide to make investment decisions if you think that willy-nilly, depending on who's in power and what the what the environment is, what the political environment is, an investment that you made in one area under one administration is going to be undone by another administration at another time, because that's exactly what's happening here. One administration, one party is undoing what was done perfectly legally 3 years ago. Now, it makes sense to me, right? That if something is done that Congress just disagrees with, that you would have a window of time to undo it. I think 60 days, 90 days, as we have with the CRA and with the Federal Land Management Practices Act. That makes sense. Congress says, nope, that's not what we want. That's not what we intended. That was not our legislative intent when we wrote this. We're going to undo it, and that makes sense to me. If an administration does a mineral withdrawal like we did here, like the Biden administration did here, and Congress says that was a mistake, that doesn't comply with the laws as we wrote them, we're going to change it, then by all means, go ahead and try to change it, but not 3 years later, and not in this way, not using a tool that the CRA tool was not built for this. It was built to change a regulation that Congress disagreed with. I think that it is a very dangerous, very, very dangerous precedent, and I think it's the kind of precedent that, honestly, when the shoe is on the other foot, it creates problems. And I know, Mr. President, that I've spoken with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, who are concerned about this precedent and wonder what it might mean. And, you and I both have experience in the private sector, and I think we could relate to the idea that capital likes certainty. Capital likes to minimize risk by knowing what is going to, what they can count on, and that is, I think, one of the gravest dangers of this this action that the Senate seems poised to take. In a world where the Senate is always going to be a place where people disagree with one another, where we are not always going to see things the same way, where a project that I might think shouldn't be permitted, somebody else might think is reasonable to be permitted. Those disagreements will always be there. But if we get into a situation where different parties, depending on whether they're in power or not, are just sort of kind of randomly undoing what has been in place for several years, I think it is. I just think it furthers undermines the need for it adds to chaos. It undermines certainty, and it certainly doesn't contribute to the kind of the problem-solving mentality that I think that we need around here. And of course, for my precious boundary waters, it has potentially, really significant impacts, as I've described here with the likely impact of water pollution on this precious place. And it also just leads to more lawsuits and more sort of legal wrangling that, in my mind, I wish we could just avoid. In my life as a political leader, I've always found that the best ideas usually come from the people that are closest to the ground and closest to the work and do, understand best what's going on. And so I'm going to just take a few more minutes to read some of the comments that have come my way from people who have firsthand experience with the boundary waters and know what an incredible place it is. This is a note from a constituent of mine from Edina, Minnesota, which is, again, in the Twin Cities metro area. And this person writes, they write, I know all the facts and arguments below are important, but for someone who went on Boundary Waters trips growing up, to bring my own girls starting at ages 5 and 8, it is truly a place like no other. It is my dad's happy place. He has led and gone on hundreds of BWCA trips over his lifetime, and at the young age of 72, he continues to go. This is what I was talking about earlier, about how even though this is a very wild place, it is also so accessible to people. This person goes on to write, he told myself and my husband when we were packing up for our first trip ever with the girls that from the moment that they were born, he has dreamt of this moment. The girls love it there. We've gone every year since. They adore being in the wilderness, seeing nature, and disconnecting from a world that can be so overwhelming. They look forward to it every year. As a mom, I am truly proud that my 2 girls are getting these opportunities. They are learning valuable life skills while being up there. And it doesn't hurt that we all get to disconnect from technology for a few days. I beg you to work as hard as you can to save this special place so that my daughter's kids will be able to enjoy it all in its splendor for years to come. This is a message that came to me from Waconia, Minnesota, and this is what this person writes. I first visited the BWCA on a church retreat in 2001, and it's been a magical place for me since then. As someone with a wildlife biology degree who also happens to have conservative political beliefs, I believe that protecting our country's pristine wilderness should take precedence over any financial partnerships with other countries. While it may momentarily create jobs for people in the Iron Range, those benefiting the most will be in Chile and China. Let's protect one of our country's last natural treasures so it will be around for generations to come. I have a close group of 9 girlfriends from high school, and we've been making an annual trip to the BWCA just outside Ely. Oopsie, well, this is it. This is what it looks like, just outside of Ely. For 23 years now. I am now a 41-year-old mother, and it is still my favorite weekend of the year. Please vote no to protect the environment, the animals, and my own personal sanity. I need the BWCA to remain protected. Remember, take nothing but pictures, leave nothing but footprints, kill nothing but time. I love that. This is making me think that there's been, some things written, some things said about what is it that Minnesota wants when it comes to this this mine and this place and protecting this place. And I want to, my stories that I'm reading give wonderful anecdotes about what people think about it. But I think I'm just going to bring some polling into this here, because this is polling that shows what Minnesotans think about this broadly across different parties. And I think it's important to know that this was research that was done just in December of 2025. It is quite recent. And this research shows us that Minnesotans are deeply connected to the Boundary Waters Canoe area wilderness and intensely support its protection. Multiple polls over the last 10 years have consistently shown this deep connection amongst voters across all political alignments. And so this connection drives opposition to sulfide ore copper mining within the Boundary Waters watershed by double-digit margins. Minnesota voters are generally pro-mining, as I talked about earlier. They're pro-mining for iron ore, for taconite, and for copper nickel, with one important exception. They overwhelmingly oppose sulfide ore copper mines that would be located in the watershed of the Boundary Waters. So this is, I'm going to give you some of the data in a minute, but I think this is something I was saying earlier and I want to return to. Minnesota is a pro-mining state. We are so proud of our mining heritage, and we're very, very proud of the continuing contributions that we make to the nation's economy through iron ore. We are the #1 producer of iron ore in the whole country. It is a crucial part of our economic foundation, and we're excited about the opportunity to develop new precious metals mining in Minnesota as these new deposits in the Duluth complex are being explored. But Minnesotans' view is not this mine in this place. That is the issue here, because they understand how popular, they understand how precious this place is. So here's some of the data that I think is interesting. So the Boundary Waters is uniquely popular, and voters across all political parties say protecting it is an important priority. 60% of Minnesotans say that they have been to the Boundary Waters. That's kind of incredible. The Boundary Waters is viewed favorably by nearly all Minnesotans across the state. 86% of Minnesotans have a favorable view, and 67% of Minnesotans have a very favorable view of the Boundary Waters. Now, I don't know what your state is like, Mr. President, but to find something that 60% of people say they have done, and what was it here? 86% of people have a favorable view of. That's a pretty big deal in our state, that everybody agrees on this. And I think that it's important to understand, like kind of break that down a little bit, because you might be thinking, is this something that is driven by party politics? And I can tell you, as a senator from Minnesota, that there is nothing political about people's love of the Boundary Waters. It is not a Democratic love or a Republican love or an independent love. And you can see that in this data. When you ask Minnesotans, how much of a priority do you think it should be for Minnesota elected officials to protect the Boundary Waters from mining pollution? Overall, 68% say it's a priority. 87% of Democrats say this. 66% of independents say this, and 50% of Republicans say this. So it is not, again, it is not a partisan issue. By more than a 2-to-1 margin, Minnesota voters oppose sulfide or copper mining in the Boundary Waters watershed. And opposition is consistent. It has been consistent over quite a few years because this issue has been very much on Minnesotans' minds for quite a few years. This has been like in the works for nearly 10 years. And so I think it's important to understand that this is consistent. And it's also interesting, support for sulfide ore copper mining in the Boundary Waters watershed has actually dropped 8 years over the last 3 years. So, strong support for the Boundary Waters, strong opposition to developing a mine right in the watershed of the Boundary Waters, and actually a growing concern for what this might mean. It says, I'll just read this, it says, this is consistent with the view that Minnesotans generally support mining outside the Boundary Waters watershed by a 14% margin. 40% favor, only 26% oppose, and they strongly oppose sulfide ore copper mining within the Boundary Waters watershed. So this, I love this because it sort of shows that Minnesotans, I guess no surprise, as a Minnesota senator, I should be reflecting the views of my constituents, and I think that that's the case here. Being pro-mining, wanting to see that opportunity, wanting to see that develop, but not this mine in this place. If you look at the biggest differences in opposition between mining in Minnesota versus mining in the Boundary Waters watershed, it's really quite interesting. There's the difference amongst independents is plus 62. That's a very big number for people who look at polling across the board. And I don't know if it shows this in this memo that I'm referring to, Mr. President, but I can tell you because I've seen the data that this is also not a regional thing. And even in northern Minnesota, and even in the 8th Congressional District where this mine would be, a majority of people in the 8th Congressional District would agree with the statement, not this mine in this place. So you can imagine what Minnesotans are thinking about tonight if they are watching me talk here and thinking about what the Senate is doing, and they're asking themselves, like, why is the Senate, why did the U.S. House, why are they undoing this protection that we had in place that we wanted? Why are they ignoring what we think should be happening in our state? Why are they ignoring or undermining or undoing the protections that we want to see in place for these public lands that matter so much to them? I mean, I think it's. I can tell you from the conversations that I've been having that it is contributing to their lack of trust in this body. The ability of this body to, produce action and legislation that actually reflects what they want to see happen, and it's frustrating to them, and they're asking me, why is this happening? Why is it even possible that something that was done correctly and done legally, years ago, is now being undone by a lot of people who've never even been to Minnesota, don't really even know what this is all about. And it's difficult for me to explain exactly why, given this is happening. And that's why I'm here tonight, to talk about this in all the ways that I can and help to try to change the flow of this debate as I'm trying to change the flow of this polluting water through the Boundary Waters. I would like to take a couple of minutes and talk a little bit about the work that was done to establish this mineral lease withdrawal, because I think there's also been some discussion about what was really involved in that, and shouldn't we just really let sort of the permitting process play out and as it normally would? And I would say, Mr. President, I understand that argument that there is a we have established a permitting process at the state level and at the federal level, and that should be allowed to play out. But it's interesting because Congress also in this Federal Land Management Policy Act said that there might be occasions when there are places where we want to be able to withdraw those mineral leases because we can see ahead of time, before all of the work has been done, we can see ahead of time based on our environmental assessment that this is not wise, that this doesn't make sense. And that is exactly what happened with the Rainy River withdrawal environmental assessment, which was done with extensive work. I've got it all right here, Mr. President. I do not think that I will read it all to you all tonight. But I want to just highlight some of the pieces of this so that it can give colleagues an idea about how comprehensive this environmental assessment was. I mean, honestly, much more comprehensive than the Congressional Review Authority resolution that is before the Senate right now that included, no outreach, no scientific evidence. Certainly there was nothing that's presented in this CRA that says, nope, this is all wrong, that was done in this environmental review. It was none of that at all. So let me just highlight some of these, some of what is in this Rainy River withdrawal, which is the basis for the mineral lease withdrawal, to give you some confidence that it was done with a lot of integrity and a lot of scientific backdrop. So the environmental assessment says this, that the purpose of the requested withdrawal is to protect and preserve natural and cultural resources in the Rainy River watershed, including the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Mining Protection Area, and the 1854 ceded territory. Let me just let everyone know that is the ground that is covered by the 1854 treaty between the federal government and the Chippewa tribes of northern Minnesota that gives them hunting and fishing and wild rice harvesting rights. So it's saying basically the purpose of this requested withdrawal is to protect and preserve natural and cultural resources in the Rainy River watershed from the known and potential adverse environmental impacts arising from exploration and development of federally owned minerals. The withdrawal is needed because the Forest Service and the BLM have seen and can reasonably anticipate increasing interest within the private sector for developing the copper-nickel ore mines in the Duluth complex that may adversely impact the Rainy River watershed. This goes on to describe what the decision-making process of the what looked like under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. It describes how this act, written by Congress, of course, signed into law, authorizes the Secretary of the Interior to make and modify and extend or revoke withdrawals in accordance with the terms of the law. And that's what this is all about. So what happens in this environmental assessment is that they look at alternatives. They look at an alternative where there is where the leases are withdrawn for 20 years, to be clear, or a second alternative where there is no withdrawal and the leases continue. And they evaluate what is likely to happen, what's likely to happen to the environment. They also evaluate what is likely to happen to the socioeconomics of the region, because of course these things are always a balance. We don't want to live in a world where all we do is to protect environmental resources, but there's no way for people to earn a living or to feed their families or to own their own home. And so let me just highlight some of this because I think it's interesting and gets to that point. This region around the Boundary Waters has a long history of mineral exploration and extraction, with mining activity attracting migrants and establishing communities since the 19th century. Similarly, the region's unique natural amenities and recreation opportunities have been the source of recreation and tourism and an amenity-based economy. The relative concentration of jobs in both mining and tourism-related sectors demonstrate these economic dependencies within the region, which I can say from personal experience is very true. So in 2019, the mining-related employment was estimated at 3% of total employment in St. Louis County, Cook counties, and Lake counties. That is this region. So think about that, 3%. This represents over 40% of all mining sector jobs in the state. Sectors associated with recreation and tourism also make up a higher proportion of total jobs in the study area relative to the state average. In 2019, recreation and tourism-dependent jobs, so that includes retail, trade, arts, and entertainment, recreation, accommodation, and food services, that was 22% of total employment in the three-county analysis plan. But of course, job numbers tell only part of the economic picture. Average annual wages vary substantially by sector. The average wage in natural resource extraction sectors is generally high compared to wages in many other sectors. That is certainly the case. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, this goes on to say, provides many thousands of visitors with a unique, primitive, and nature-based recreation experience. The wilderness area also provides an economic driver to local communities and the state of Minnesota. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness is surrounded by resorts and outfitters and guides and campgrounds and other visitor service businesses and hundreds of home and cabins. In 2018, visitors to the wilderness area were estimated to contribute between 230 and 570 jobs and 6 million to 14.8 million in labor income all across this region, which is we call the Arrowhead region in Minnesota. So I like that this is looking at the socioeconomics of this and kind of what are we going to do, how do we kind of maximize the benefit here. I want to also just say I think it's important, because I always come back to this, the impacts on tribes in northern Minnesota. And this assessment points the following out, that the lands proposed for withdrawal include the homelands and traditional use areas of Lake Superior Chippewa tribe, comprised of multiple independent bands living around Lake Superior in what is the northern parts of Minnesota. And this is, I think, important. The Ojibwe bands were signatories of key treaties executed with the federal government in the 19th century. And this withdrawal application area falls entirely within the 1854 ceded territory of the Lake Superior Chippewa from lands deemed to have been under the sole control of the signatories at the time of signing. So every single thing that we're talking about here falls within the 1854 ceded territory. And this is not some historic document that is interesting to know about but has no impact on our daily life, because this treaty is still in effect. It's still established. It still establishes these hunting and fishing and wild rice harvesting rights that exist to this day. Still establishes the right that the Lake Superior Chippewa people, the Anishinaabe people of northern Minnesota have around moose and deer and fish and berries and wild rice, their sugar bush sites, their maple stands, the white cedar stands, ducks, other forest resources. Of course, these resources are available to everybody, but they have a particular legal access point for the folks, for the tribal nations. It's not known in many parts of the country, but in Minnesota, wild rice, manoomin, is a hugely important food source and also very important culturally to Native people. And it's a very important part of the ecosystem of this part of Minnesota. And wild rice is a wetland plant that grows in exactly this kind of ecosystem. It is, again, super important to the Ojibwe people. And this wild rice, it grows in very shallow freshwater marshes on the edges of lakes and rivers. It typically grows, only to about 3 feet high, and it is it's a very, very important part of what is included in these treaties. So I think it's important to understand that. as I go through this environmental assessment to share what it evaluates in terms of the opportunities in this area, what needs to be protected, and what impact you might see from the mine, I want to just share a little bit of that with you. I just need to find it here. This talks about, let me find it here. Here we go. This is a good summary, I think, of what the environmental assessment finds. It says the greatest potential risk to water quality of the wilderness area and lands within the withdrawal area comes from the catastrophic failure of a wet basin tailing storage or impoundment dam. Wet basin tailing storages pose the risk of dam failure and the potential release of a large volume of contaminated sediment or tailings into the water to a nearby water body, with potential transport of that downstream water bodies and receptors. Dam failures have the greatest potential of traveling downstream in a volume that could impact receiving wilderness area water resources. Impacts would be most severe for streams and wetlands and lakes most adjacent to the failure. Failure would be highly likely to result in increases of total dissolved solids, sulfate, metals, and other constituents, exceedance of water quality standards, and observable impacts of aquatic biota and habitat in Birch Lake, becoming successively less severe, of course, as the water moves forward. But it assesses that the risk effects to the Boundary Waters Canoe area would be significant and can't be mitigated in any way. I think that is the reason why this environmental assessment forms the basis for the mineral lease withdrawal. And again, the mineral lease withdrawal is for 20 years. And 20 years seems like a long time. I've been in the Senate for 9 years, half of that time. But the idea here is that you don't want to lock these minerals up forever. That doesn't seem reasonable. But given what the technology is right now, given what we know about the environmental risks and what this kind of mining would do, something is going to have to change before this makes sense, before this is a risk worth taking. And I believe that that is really the message that I take out of this environmental assessment, along with the many hundreds of thousands of people who wrote in talking about this and saying why this mattered to them. I think during the course of this discussion, we're talking about the special place that this is, also talking about the unusual precedent, the remarkable and dangerous precedent that this CRA establishes should it pass, and also talking about the special consideration that I think that we need to give to Native people who have particular and sovereign treaty rights related to this this place. And I want to just, if I can, take a minute to go over in a bit of detail what some of the tribes have said about this, because I think it gives a good impact, gives a good sense of why this is important to them. And let me just find this for you before while I'm looking for that, I want to share these other things with you because I think they're helpful. Senator Heinrich spoke about this earlier, and it was really remarkable to me that as we were considering this CRA, it was just coming over from the House to the Senate, that we received here in the Senate an open letter from President Theodore Roosevelt's direct descendants talking about the importance of saving the boundary waters. And I'm going to just read this letter to make sure that people have had a chance to understand what it says. The letter says, "Dear United States Senators, the purpose of this letter is to strongly recommend all senators vote against House Joint Resolution 140 and to ask you to work with President Trump to seek ways to permanently protect the boundary waters and to send a unified message that America is still a land that relentlessly protects its greatest wilderness terrain. The proposed House resolution erroneously uses the Congressional Review Act to disallow the current withdrawal of over 225,000 acres in the headwaters of the boundary waters, and would greenlight exposure of this national treasure to the highly toxic and destructive impacts of sulfide ore copper mining. It is faulty on several key fronts. First, it's the opposite of America First. The mining company in question is foreign-owned, will use Chinese state-owned smelters, and will then sell the extracted metals on the open market. Next, it removes the American public from public land decision-making. A key priority of American public land policy has always been to have a strong bias towards obtaining robust public input. Hundreds of thousands of Americans have already weighed in on the boundary waters, and they overwhelmingly want it protected forever. Next, it discards sound science. A detailed environmental assessment has already documented the substantial risk copper mining poses to this highly valued ecosystem. It sets a very bad precedent for other public lands. Using the CRA in this fashion, which has never been done before, would put at risk other public land withdrawals across America to similarly irresponsible actions. Finally, the proposed resolution is diametrically at odds with the conservation legacy of President Theodore Roosevelt. For all these reasons, we feel a deep obligation to TR, as they call him in this letter, to speak out loudly in support of this exceptional American wilderness area. As TR said at the Grand Canyon in 1903, we now reiterate with the boundary waters today, leave it as it is. Vote no on House Joint Resolution 140 or any other similar legislation and seek creative ways to protect the boundary waters forever. Frankly, TR would have been appalled at House Resolution 140 and the misguided and harmful effort to revoke a sound and necessary mineral withdrawal in the headwaters of the boundary waters. To understand TR's perspective on all of this, it's important to review a little of his history, starting with Minnesota. TR had a strong affinity for Minnesota. TR's love of Minnesota emanated directly from Lincoln and Grant's leadership during the Civil War. Minnesota immediately stepped up to support the dire cause. TR has a huge amount of respect for the 1st Minnesota Regiment, who literally saved the Union at Gettysburg. It's perhaps why, shortly after the Civil War, as a 10-year-old sitting in Germany, TR dreamed of proudly going to Minnesota someday. He hoped to get there when he was 14, and he cheered in his diary about the prospects. Hip, hip, hurrah. In 1880, TR's first extended hunting trip to the west brought him as far as the Red River in Moorhead, Minnesota, way up in the northwestern quadrant of our state, where he briefly ducked into the Dakota Territory for the first time. From then on, TR's strong historical connections and interest in Minnesota accelerated exponentially. In 1883, he signed his first cattle ranching contract in St. Paul. And the rest of the 1880s and in the 1990s, he crossed through the state on many memorable occasions. In 1900, he launched his vice presidential campaign in Minnesota. And in 1901, he gave his famous Big Stick speech at the Minnesota State Fair. These are just a few small samplings of TR's oversized affection for Minnesota, which helped to catapult him towards his destiny. TR worked exceedingly hard to protect Minnesota's forests and water. It should come as no surprise that TR's appreciations for Minnesota translated into an aggressive pursuit of protecting the state's favored forests and water. In 1902, shortly after taking office, TR used scientific forestry to establish the Minnesota Forest Reserve, which was later renamed the Chippewa National Forest. It was the first national forest reserve in America east of the Mississippi River, and the first one set aside through an act of Congress rather than by presidential proclamation. Around the same time frame, closer to America's northern border, TR's administration withdrew hundreds of thousands of acres in Lake and Cook counties in the vicinity of the Boundary Waters to get a jump start on protecting this even more pristine source of water. Finally, in 1909, for the public good, TR formally established the much broader Superior National Forest, where the Boundary Waters Canoe Wilderness Area resides. Based on all of these proactive measures, there is no doubt TR wanted Minnesota's greatest natural resource, its most beloved Boundary Waters ecosystem, protected in perpetuity for all future generations to enjoy. It was a central tenet of his balanced approach to conservationism. Saving the boundary waters makes common bipartisan sense. Because of the foresight of America's early Republican leaders, the Boundary Waters has risen, as per the Department of the Interior, to become America's most heavily visited wilderness area. Its greatness goes way beyond Minnesota. It is the fourth pillar of all of America's greatest continental wilderness terrain: Yosemite, Lincoln-Harrison, Yellowstone, Grant, the Grand Canyon, Roosevelt, and the Boundary Waters. Saving it from the devastating effects of copper mining is therefore the conservation imperative of our time and should be bipartisan in nature. It is certainly bipartisan in Minnesota, as evidenced by the fact 70% of Minnesotans want the Boundary Waters permanently protected. Minnesotans know, aside from the devastating impact on the environment, copper-nickel mining in the Boundary Waters would deal a crushing blow to a great rural American economy. It would kill jobs, dampen growth, decrease affordability, and erase any meaningful prospects for future economic prosperity in the region. For all of these reasons, we are positive TR would want the Boundary Waters protected in a bipartisan fashion. But sadly, the passage of House Joint Resolution 140 in the House puts all of this in grave jeopardy. Our specific ask of United States senators: to America's senators, please do all that you can to protect this national treasure. On both sides of the political aisle, we strongly ask you to vote no on this resolution and on any other similar legislation proposed in the future. TR was active in the preserving of our greatest wilderness terrain on both the east and west coasts. It became one of the greatest enduring legacies of his life. It is now time for all of you to get in the arena with him. We implore you to do your own parts to ensure TR's common sense approach to conservationism is as strong today as it was more than a century ago. There is no better place to do this than to preserve the greatest wilderness terrain in the middle of America's heartland, the Boundary Waters. The Greatest America 250 conservation gift, protecting the fourth pillar. This letter concludes in this way. In conjunction with America's 250th birthday, we ask you to honor President Theodore Roosevelt's conservation legacy. As TR's Presidential Library formally opens in Medora, North Dakota on Independence Day, 3 pillars of TR's life will take central stage: leadership, conservation, and citizenship. It's one thing for politicians to say they believe in these 3 pillars, and it is quite another to see them act that way. We humbly submit it would be hard to gift America a more meaningful 4th pillar, one that better unites these 3 aspects of his legacy than a huge enduring present in the form of a permanently protected Boundary Waters. Finally, it should be noted that the signatories below represent the 3 branches of Theodore Roosevelt's family, emanating directly from his 3 sons, who all served in both World War I and World War II. Quinton Roosevelt was sadly killed in action in World War I, or he certainly would have risen to the call of service a second time. The 4 of us below, this is important, the 4 of us below have never collectively co-signed a letter together, which should give an indication of how strongly we support voting no on this resolution, and then voting yes on permanent Boundary Waters protection. We greatly appreciate your time and attention to this matter. This is signed by Theodore Roosevelt IV, Teddy Roosevelt's great-grandson, and co-signed by Tweed Roosevelt, Kermit Roosevelt III, and Mark Roosevelt. Mr. President, I just think this is so interesting because, one, it speaks to the great tradition of conservationism in the Republican Party. And I love also that it highlights these other great pillars of American, remarkable places. They talk about, in this letter, the America's greatest continental wilderness terrain: Yosemite, protected by Lincoln and Harrison; Yellowstone, protected by Grant; the Grand Canyon, and Roosevelt. And, just as it is impossible for us to imagine a big mine right on the doorstep of the Grand Canyon or Yosemite, it is impossible for us in Minnesota to imagine this mine right on the doorstep of the Boundary Waters. The Boundary Waters is the same caliber of national treasure as the Grand Canyon or Yosemite or Yellowstone. And in this country, we certainly don't say we don't want to do any mining any place, but we also acknowledge that there are places that are so special that does not need to be the place where we look to make our meet our needs for precious metals, precious minerals. I was searching a moment ago, Mr. President, for I mentioned that I wanted to share some of the views of the America's indigenous tribes talking about why they think that it is important to protect the Boundary Waters. And I've got a few here that I'm going to read to you. And I'm going to start with the letter from the National Congress of American Indian, which, as you no doubt know, is the oldest and largest organization of sovereign tribal nations from around the country. I'm going to. This is actually not a letter. Forgive me. This is a resolution that the National Congress of American Indian put forward a few weeks ago, speaking on behalf of all of the tribes, all of the tribes that are members. It goes as follows. It's called Calling on the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs to hold a hearing to consider and take testimony on House Joint Resolution 140 entitled Disapproving Public Land Order 7917 due to the impacted tribal interests contained in the subject public land order. It goes as follows. Whereas we, the members of the National Congress of American Indians of the United States, invoking the design blessing of the Creator upon our efforts and purposes in order to preserve for ourselves and our descendants the inherent sovereign rights of our Indian nations, rights secured under Indian treaties and agreements with the United States, and all other rights and benefits to which we are entitled under the laws and Constitution of the United States and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to enlighten the public toward a better understanding of the Indian people, to preserve Indian cultural values, and otherwise promote the health, safety, and welfare of the Indian people, do hereby establish and submit the following resolution. And whereas the National Congress of American Indians, NCAI, was established in 1944 and is the oldest and largest national organization of American Indian and Alaska Native tribal governments, and whereas the Ojibwe people have resided in North America since time immemorial and before the establishment of the United States, have resided among what has become the border between the United States and Canada and the places now called Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and North Dakota. And whereas the Ojibwe people entered into numerous treaties with the United States, ceding land and reserving rights within those lands in exchange for peace, protection, and services, including the Treaty of La Pointe, September 30th, 1854. And whereas in the 1854 treaty, the Ojibwe reserved rights to hunt, fish, and gather within the territory ceded, the 1854 ceded territory, and such rights remain intact and are presently exercised by the current beneficiaries of the 1854 treaty. And whereas, over time, the federal government took land within the ceded territory for conservation and protection, including the Superior National Forest and the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, both within the Rainy River watershed, which runs along the current U.S.-Canada border in what is now northeastern Minnesota. And whereas the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness is a globally unique freshwater ecosystem with some of the world's cleanest water, it comprises 20% of the fresh water within the entire national forest system, and through its interconnected system of lakes, forests, and wetlands, provides irreplaceable habitat for threatened species like the lynx and the loon, and by doing so offers invaluable cultural and recreational resources, including resources that the Ojibwe utilize when exercising their reserved treaty rights. And whereas, as recognized in NCAI Resolution SEA 025-10, wild rice, manuman, is the sacred food of the Ojibwe people, integral to their identity and necessary for their subsistence. And the federal government must protect the waters of the 1854 ceded territory from contamination to maintain traditional harvesting of wild rice, which is the Ojibwe treaty-guaranteed usufructuary right. And whereas on January 31st, 2023, then Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, issued Public Land Order 7917, withdrawing approximately 225,504 acres of National Forest System lands from disposition under the United States mineral and geothermal leasing laws for a period of 20 years to protect and preserve the 1854 ceded territory of the Lake Superior Chippewa in northern Minnesota from the political adverse effects of mineral and geothermal exploration and development. And whereas the order further provides that the purpose for the withdrawal is also to protect the health, traditional cultural values, and subsistence-based lifestyle of the tribal nations that rely on resources in the region, such as wild rice, which are particularly susceptible to adverse impacts associated with mineral exploration and development. And whereas NCAI acknowledges that any threat to tribal rights and treaty rights of one tribal nation erodes the reserved tribal and treaty rights of all tribal nations, thereby eroding tribal sovereignty. And whereas House Joint Resolution 140, introduced in the U.S. House of Representatives on January 12th, 2026, authorizes the disapproval of Public Land Order 7917, and whereas the U.S. House of Representatives enacted House Joint Resolution 140 without a hearing and without soliciting input from the impacted parties, including from the tribal nations whose treaty rights are impacted by the disapproval, and whereas, pursuant to the rules of the Congressional Review Act, adoption and enactment of House Joint Resolution 140 would permanently preclude any future consideration or action by the executive branch, forever stripping the impacted tribal nations of their right to be consulted prior to federal actions that materially impact their lives, lands, and interests. And whereas House Joint Resolution 140 has been transmitted to the United States Senate, and because disapproval of the underlying public land order directly impacts more than one federally recognized tribe's treaty-guaranteed rights, the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs should hold a hearing on Public Land Order 7917 in order to solicit testimony from the impacted tribal nations before Senate floor consideration. Now, therefore, be it resolved that NCAI urges the United States Senate Indian Affairs Committee to expeditiously schedule a hearing regarding the contents of Public Land Order 7917 and the potential detrimental impact adopting House Joint Resolution 140 would have on treaty rights by soliciting testimony from the tribal nations impacted. And be it further resolved that NCAI insists that the administration and the Congress protect the unique ecosystems of the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness from contamination and encroachment, which is the underlying purpose of Public Land Order 7917. And be it finally resolved that this resolution shall be the policy of NCAI until it is withdrawn or modified by any subsequent resolution. Now, I think this is important for a couple of reasons. One, this is such an important organization reflecting so many tribal nations. It is important also that they are saying clearly that they believe that the public land order in place right now is protecting their tribal sovereignty and treaty rights as it should be protected. And the resolution is also saying that if you're going to take such a dramatic step, United States Senate, you ought to at least have a hearing in the Senate Indian Affairs Committee to create an opportunity for tribal nations to express their views on this. Now, of course, that hearing hasn't happened. Because the CRA came before the Senate as a privileged resolution, it was not possible to refer this to the committee during this process that we're going on. There are so many things that are limited, the Senate is limited from doing because of the form in which the House sent this resolution over to the Senate. But I think it is a travesty that at the very least, a hearing exploring the impacts on tribal nations before that hearing will not have been held before members of the Senate are making a decision that has such a significant impact on treaty rights and tribal nations in Minnesota. And as this letter says, it has impacts. What impacts one tribal nation impacts all tribal nations in this environment, in this situation. Now, having the support of the National Congress of American Indian is extremely important. But I also want to just note that the Minnesota Chippewa tribes, which are all of the Chippewa tribes in northern Minnesota, have also expressed their strong disapproval of this action that the Senate is contemplating tonight. And so I'm going to read the letter that the Minnesota Chippewa tribe sent to Senator Klobuchar and me, so that everyone will, so that it will also be in the record. And here's the letter, which was written on March 4th, my birthday. Is to Senator Tina Smith and Senator Amy Klobuchar, vote no on mining in and around the boundary waters. Dear Senator Smith and Klobuchar, I write at the direction of the leadership of the 6 bands of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, otherwise MCT, all of which are federally recognized Indian tribes under the umbrella of the MCT. As you know, in January, House Joint Resolution 140 passed the House and rolls back the 20-year ban on mining in and around the Boundary Waters Canoe area wilderness and within the Superior National Forest in Minnesota. The MCT strongly opposes any mining in that area and asks that you vote no on any companion bill in the Senate. And we thank you both for your public statements to date in opposition of this destructive measure. Members of those MCT bands who were signatories to the 1854 Treaty of La Pointe, which encompasses the Boundary Waters Canoe Area wilderness, retain the right to enter millions of acres in the Arrowhead region of Minnesota to exercise their treaty reserved rights to hunt and fish and gather. The entire area is Ojibwe homeland. In fact, one of the key purposes of the Bureau of Land Management order withdrawing these superior national forest lands from potential mineral and geothermal leasing was, quote, to protect and preserve the fragile and vital social and natural resources, ecological integrity, and wilderness values from the potential diverse effects of mineral and geothermal exploration and development. The 1854 ceded territory was expressly called out as one of the areas that must be protected. The letter includes a map of the ceded territory, and the letter concludes by saying, again, we appreciate your opposition to lifting the mining ban and your support of tribes in this region. Thank you. I have here also letters from the White Earth Reservation expressing their opposition to mining in or near the Boundary Waters wilderness. I have a letter from the Midwest Alliance of Sovereign Tribes. All of the Anishinaabe tribes across Minnesota and Wisconsin are all relatives. This is another letter basically saying, we are writing to you today on an issue of utmost importance to all of our members. It is our understanding that House Joint Resolution may soon be brought to the floor. This resolution is a measure brought under the Congressional Review Act to repeal a current rule banning copper sulfide mining. We urge you and your colleagues to vote no on this measure. I have here a letter from the Eastern Shoshone tribe, which is a Wyoming tribe, sent to Senator Lummis, Senator Thune, and also to Senator Schumer and Senator Barrasso. It includes an opposition saying clearly on behalf of the Eastern Shoshone Business Council urging the Senate to oppose House Joint Resolution 140. I have a letter from the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation urging opposition to this resolution. I have a letter from the Rosebud Sioux tribe from Rosebud, South Dakota, urging resolution to this CRA. Mr. President, I have here a letter from early February to all of the members of the Senate, and I'm just going to read you a bit of it, but I think I want you to know that there is, at the end of this letter, it is signed by, I mean, my word, I'd have to count them all up. I would guess 40 or 50 small businesses in Minnesota. Many of them from the area, you know, they benefit so much from the natural resources of northern Minnesota and from the outdoor recreation economy of northern Minnesota. And they are urging the United States Senate to oppose House Joint Resolution 140, which could revoke, I'm just going to read you a bit of it. It says, the Boundary Waters and Downstream Voyageurs National Park are currently protected by Public Land Order 7917, the 20-year mineral withdrawal banning copper nickel mine on federal public lands in the headwaters of these beloved wild lands. This mining ban is based on the U.S. Forest Service Comprehensive Environmental Assessment, which concluded that sulfide ore copper mining near the Boundary Waters would cause irreversible harm to the region's watershed, fish, and wildlife, treaty and tribal rights, and robust recreation economy. The analysis completed by the Forest Service in 2022 included 675,000 public comments, over 95% of which favored protecting the Boundary Waters and Voyageurs from sulfide ore copper mining. Overturning the mining ban puts at risk the forests and the clean waters of the region, as well as its towns, indigenous communities, and the regional economy. The love for the Boundary Waters powers a strong and enduring recreation economy in northeastern Minnesota, responsible for 17,000 jobs and over $1 billion in sales annually in the region. This includes the many businesses many of us have created and grown, which will be seriously damaged if sulfide ore copper mining were allowed in this fragile environment. The wilderness is also a crown jewel of Minnesota and important to the state's growing $13.5 billion outdoor economy. Economic studies show that protecting the Boundary Waters would be better for the economy than opening the area to copper mining. The letter goes on to say, once compromised, the Boundary Waters cannot be restored. This region is much more than a beautiful place. It embodies the best of our public lands: clean water, expansive habitat, world-class recreation, vibrant wilderness edge communities, and sustainable local economies. Generations of Midwesterners and Americans from across the country have formed deep connections to nature through hunting and fishing and camping and canoeing and hiking in the Boundary Waters. We urge you to vote no on House Joint Resolution 140. Do not sell out our wilderness, our way of life, and our businesses. This letter is signed by, I won't read all of the people that have signed it, but Ely Outfitting in Ely, Minnesota, Freeman's Explore, the Lodge of Whispering Pines, River Point Resort, Wilderness Cabins, the Paragus Northwoods Company, Voyager Outward Bound School, North of North Resort, Ely Cabin Collective, Final Touch Proofreading and Editing. I'm sure there is, advertising and marketing jobs connected to the Boundary Waters. White Pine Productions. These are all businesses in Ely, Minnesota. Then there are many others in North Shore Adventure Park in Silver Bay, Big City Mountaineers in Tower, Granite Gear in Two Harbors, Madison Elise LLC in Alexandria, Little Bug Enterprises in Bemidji, Java Moose in Grand Marais, the Fisherman's Daughter in Grand Marais. I mean, there are dozens of businesses that are listed here, and I think this just goes to show how the outdoor recreation economy powers these small businesses. They are the employers and the drivers of Minnesota's economy, and listening to them and hearing what they have to say as we make this decision is just so important. Mr. President, the hour grows late, and I know that we have people who have been here all day long, and I am going to take a couple of, take a bit more of the time that I have, 5 hours all in on this extremely important topic, just to talk a little bit more about some of the feedback that I have gotten from Minnesotans before I wrap up tonight. And here's something that I think is really an important, really an interesting note that I have gotten from Lakeville, Minnesota. And this person says the following. They say, I've moved to Minnesota over a decade ago from Chicago. As someone born in Iowa, I visited Minnesota often. When making the decision to move to Minnesota, a huge draw for us was outdoors. We visit the Boundary Waters Canoe area every year, and my kids know the feeling of a great hike and the beautiful scenery to go with it. If this resolution passes Congress, not only will my grandchildren not be able to enjoy this beautiful place, but my kids will watch it disappear before their eyes. Please protect this land, protect beauty, and protect the feeling of a great hike. This is a letter from Lake Elmo, Minnesota. It's very short, and she says, I am a 79-year-old woman who goes to the BWCAW with my kids and grandchildren. Chile mining in the area will hurt the tour industry. Thank you for sending that. Here's, read a couple more here before I close. This is from St. Augusta, Minnesota, and it says, I am a 45-year resident of Minnesota. I'm an Eagle Scout, husband, and father of 3 daughters. I've been an outdoor enthusiast from a very early age, deer hunting with extended family and camping with the Scouts. When my daughters were old enough, I began planning annual trips into the BWCAW for 4 to 6 days, acquiring all the equipment necessary and passing on my knowledge and appreciation of the outdoors, hoping that one day they'll take up the mantle with our children and help protect these critical ecosystems. I also require that no phones or electronic devices accompany us on our BW adventures, something my daughters label as a technology detox, and in my opinion, provides a type of reset against an increasingly technological existence. Here's a note from somebody from Big Lake, Minnesota. I am Minnesota born and raised. I grew up in a Republican household with a father who showed me all the true beauty and wonder of this state through fishing, hunting, foraging, and camping. The land that makes up this state and all the creatures and features within it have given me a purpose and a mission. I went to college at Gustavus Adolphus, where I studied the environment, and I got a job there guiding others on how to enjoy the outdoors and invest in protecting the wonderful state that gives them these opportunities. I've seen the impact firsthand on how countless times people's whole worlds have changed when they're introduced to the beauty and recreation of the land of 10,000 lakes, of which you are representing me. If I could sit down with you to face Mr. Emmer, you would see the absolute fear in my eyes at the prospect of losing more wild areas than we already have. And I can assure you that sentiment is shared by a vast majority of Minnesotans. No matter what side of the aisle people are on, they can unite over the unique beauty and foundational importance that our ecosystems have, not only on the very water we drink and the air that we breathe, but in the foundation for pride in our chest when we beam that we are from Minnesota. I sincerely urge you to consider this deeply, to talk to those you represent about the impact that this would have, and to take heed to science. This isn't about me. This is about every little kid who is growing up or who is about to be born in this great state. Will they still hold that pride in their chest when they declare where they are from if the very thing that makes us Minnesotan is ripped away from them? Already I have taught young people who have never seen an obstructed night sky or know what it's like to catch a firefly. I've taught young people who know what it's like to fish at a lake their grandfather recommended and to catch nothing because the fish are gone and hear nothing but machinery instead of loon calls while they are out. Please, I am begging you on behalf of all our legacies, please fight for us. Mr. President, I think I wanted to just clarify that this letter was forwarded to me, but it was sent to Congressman Emmer of Minnesota. And this Minnesotan is begging him to listen and fight. Here's a letter from a Minnesotan that says, I'm devastated to learn that the U.S. House of Representatives has voted to repeal the long-standing ban on mining near the Boundary Waters. I've been going on yearly BWCAW trips with my mom since 2009 when I was 10 years old. I am now 27, and she's now 70, and we plan to continue our annual tradition for as long as we can. Though I haven't yet started a family, my mom has always hoped she'll be around to introduce her future grandchildren to this beautiful wilderness. I now fear, though, that the Boundary Waters itself won't be around for my children to enjoy. My mom raised me to care for nature, to leave each BWCA campsite cleaner than I found it, and it grieves me that I am powerless to preserve the Boundary Waters beyond these small actions. When we go on our 2026 trip, I'll continue to treat each campsite and portage and lake with respect and love. I can only hope that those with power in this country can, from afar, do the same. Mr. President, I don't think I could possibly read all of the letters and messages that have come from Minnesota to me over the last many months about this. And you may be wondering why I am standing here at nearly midnight, keeping everybody up. And here's why. Because I know there are so many people in Minnesota who are wondering, excuse me, I'm losing my voice. I know there are so many people in Minnesota who are wondering whether anybody in this building cares about what they think. And the one thing that I can do is to be here speaking to this mostly empty room, making sure that it's to the best of my abilities that their voices will be heard. Their voices will be heard, regardless of what the Senate does. I dearly hope that the members of this body will think about their legacy in protecting the great places in this country, to think about the risks. There are risks in this time that you must take, but then there are other risks, like the risk of polluting this beautiful place that is not necessary. It is not necessary to take. And I hope that my colleagues will also think about the precedent that taking this action will take, and the ways in which other politicians down the road will look back on the actions that this Senate is taking right now and saying they gave us permission to do the same thing because they said it was okay. And that will have impacts, not only on the Boundary Waters, this precious place, but it will have impacts on precious places all over the country, and it will have impacts on the overall integrity of our government if actions that are taken that are legal can just be undone willy-nilly. And that just seems to me to be so bad for this body, to be bad for the public lands that we all love, and to be bad for this country that we all love so much. So I stand here tonight with a mostly gone voice to give voice to all of those people in my home state and states all over this country who feel like what they think doesn't really matter. And I'm here to tell you that it does. And the power of the organizing that has happened over the last many weeks to raise up this issue in the face of a time in our country when there are so many issues that demand so much attention. A war in Iran, the brutal attacks on my home state of Minnesota by federal agents, the great, so many worries that so many people have in this country right now. Worries fundamentally about how they're going to put food on the table and how they're going to pay rent and how they're going to hold their lives together. But they organized to make sure that their voices were heard on this thing that they care so much about. And so it's been my honor and also my responsibility and my obligation to help to lift those voices up tonight. Tomorrow, I believe the Senate will vote on this, and I hope that the Senate makes a good decision not only for my home state of Minnesota and for this precious place, but also for the good of the whole, for the good of the whole country, and the protection of our public lands and the integrity of our democracy. So thank you. With that, I yield the floor.
The Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.